Hi, and welcome back to Purple Collar Life. I'm Chad, and in today's video we're talking about how to start a wood stove fire in cold weather. I'm talking really cold weather, especially for those of you who have never done this before and you're having that issue of the entire basement or your whole house filling with smoke. I'm going to tell you the tips and tricks to keep that from happening and explain to you why that happens so you can avoid doing it in the future. Now I'm going to walk you through the process I've just used to start our Buck Stove Model 91 wood stove here in our basement. It is a cold day out today. It's single digits and there are wind chills in the negatives, minus 10 to minus 20. So as you can imagine, our entire chimney is cold. The fire hasn't burned for a couple days. The whole wood stove was cold. The flue was cold. Everything was cold. And let's talk about why that creates a problem when starting a fire. Now let's start out by talking about why it's so difficult to start a fire when the entire chimney is cold and the outside temperature is cold. What typically happens, especially if you have a wood stove inside like we do in the living room of your house or down in the basement like we do, the entire chimney, in our case about 30 feet tall, being freezing cold and the flue being freezing cold, creates what they call like a backdraft of the cold air coming down through those components. And actually when you open the door of the fireplace and open the damper, that cold air is coming towards you into the warm space. And what happens is when you're trying to light the fire, that cold draft coming down through pushes the smoke out towards you and can fill the whole room with smoke. Now what I've learned over 20 years of building fires in this Buck stove, there are a couple things I can do to prevent that from happening. So let's go through best practices that I use when starting a fire. And I should note in here the importance of this, at least in our basement space, is because we do have a clothesline in the basement where we hang clothes in the wintertime to dry. The wood stove provides a nice dry heat down here in the basement, and clothes can dry pretty quickly. So not only are we heating our house with the stove, but we're saving a lot of electricity drying clothes. But since we're drying clothes on clotheslines down here in the basement, the last thing you want is to go to work or school smelling like you've been living on top of a wood stove with that smoke smell. So step one is setting the foundation for building a good fire when you know everything's cold. There are things that I've learned to do. For example, make sure that the bathroom fan is not on. So if someone has just showered and you've got that steam in the bathroom and you've got the bathroom fan on trying to evacuate that steam, that actually creates more draft down through the chimney as that air is evacuating out the bathroom. So I make sure the bathroom fan is turned off. I also make sure that I open a window down here in the basement. So there's a window just above me. I crack that window open so that air comes in here to the basement. That gives some air availability to get pulled up through the stove. The next thing I do is I make sure I use the right paper and kindling. Now, the key here is like searing a steak. You want to go hot and fast. I want to get the flue, the damper, and the chimney heated up as quickly as possible without building so big a fire that the flames are shooting out towards me and all the smoke's coming towards me. So what I've learned, the trick to that is very small pieces of kindling, and I use pine kindling, and I stack it in the cabin style, and I put crumbled up paper below it. Then I tear shreds of paper in front of the cabin and on top. And what I do is when I'm lighting those shreds of paper, I make sure to light as many places as possible so that the fire gets going with the shreds pretty fast. And I leave the door open a crack, open all of my air inlets on the stove, open the damper the whole way. My goal here is to get as much air moving forward through the stove as possible and try to keep that hot smoke and stuff from coming into the room. The shreds of paper light pretty quickly. The goal is to get the air pushing through those and onto my crumpled up paper, which is underneath the kindling. Once that crumpled up paper gets lit, I can usually see the draft change. So at first, yes, there will be a little bit of flames that come out the cracked door and some smoke coming out my way, but minimal compared to how it could be if we didn't do it this way. Once I see the draft change, it starts to pull air through the air inlets of the stove. I leave the door open still to let more air pull through. Again, my goal is to heat up the draft of the chimney as quickly as possible so all the air is moving from the basement up through the chimney. Let's talk about some mistakes I've made in the past. There have been times where I've shortchanged myself on both paper or kindling. And what happens then is you do get the start of a fire going, but it's not hot enough, it's not fast enough, and all that smoke billows into, in our case, our basement. All that smoke is not something you want to have filling your house, setting off the smoke detectors, and you dealing with, fanning the smoke detectors so they stop beeping, trying to open up windows and get all that smoke to get out of your house on an already frigid, cold day. So don't shortchange yourself when it comes to paper. Paper is cheap and it's easy to ball up and shred up along with your kindling wood. Don't shortchange yourself on kindling wood. I chop up more than I need so that I've got extra to throw in if the fire would start to die down before that updraft gets started. And then have a process. So I use the Alexa timer on the wall to set timers. I don't necessarily stand down here for a half an hour, and getting a good fire started does take at least a half an hour. I typically, once I see that updraft going through, I set a timer for about 5 minutes. I go do something else. I come back down, and by then I'm usually ready to close the left-hand air vent. That's the shotgun air vent into the wood stove, and I start closing the damper. Once I start closing the damper, I just do it a little bit at a time. This is a catalytic combustion stove. I do not want to push that damper all the way in until the catalytic combustion chamber reaches its temperature, which I think has to be 600 or 800 degrees to properly combust the smoke. So as you can see, I'm still not all the way in now, and we've been burning this fire for about a half an hour. The next step in my process, I've closed that. I start to put in bigger pieces of wood. If I've got any pieces of wood that had a knot in them, like I couldn't split the kindling wood, it had a knot, or there was a chunk that I didn't want to split, I put those in next. That establishes some good hot coals on the bottom of the fire and makes it ready for putting in larger pieces of firewood. Now, before you put any piece of firewood in, but especially when you're starting a fire, you want that firewood to be dry. I keep a wood moisture meter right down here in the basement with me. I stick the prongs into that firewood, make sure that it is dry. I made a whole video about how dry your firewood should be to burn it. I put a link to that up above and down below in the description. But especially when you're starting a fire, 15% or less, I like it to be 10 to 12% to go into the fireplace so it easily ignites from those coals, keeps that heat going up the chimney, and prevents the smoke from coming down and backdrafting into your house or your basement. I'll put an Amazon affiliate link to moisture meter like this one down in the description. There is sort of an art to building a fire. It requires patience and control. Like I said, I set those timers on the device, and it's typically 5 minutes, then check it, then 8 minutes and check it, then 15 minutes and check it, then 20 minutes and check it. So you can see you add those times up. You're talking about an hour of time to get a good solid fire built and make sure that you're safe doing that. Again, only dry wood, but you can see now we're at a point where we've got really good coals in there. I can look at my catalytic combustion temperature gauge, which is up here on the top of the stove. I know that I'm above 600 degrees now, so what I do is I pull this all the way out, push it all the way in. My damper is now fully closed to the point where it's in the catalytic combustion zone. If you don't have a catalytic combustion zone, make sure you follow the procedure for your stove. You're probably going almost all the way closed on that damper, but probably not all the way closed because you don't want to smother the fire and you still want the smoke to be able to go up the chimney. With catalytic combustion stoves, when you push this all the way in, that diverts the heat and smoke through the combustion chamber, and it actually re-burns the smoke inside your burn chamber. So you get more heat and more energy off of every piece of wood. Now, I mentioned before closing the shotgun damper on that left-hand side. Now that we've got a good fire, we are up to temperature. I'm going to close down the damper on the right hand side. I've got a spot where the paint's worn down. I can see I typically leave it right about here when the fire is first going. At nighttime, I'll close that down a little bit lower, and I'll constantly be monitoring this to see, does it need more airflow? As I add wood in, for those of you who are beginners, you want to always open up the damper fully before you open the door. Let that smoke evacuate. Open the door. Put your new piece of firewood in. What I like to do is, if there's not a good flame going, leave the door open a crack for a second. Once that new piece of firewood in, you can see that pulls a draft through, heats up all your coals even hotter, gets that flame burning on the fresh piece of firewood. And then once the fresh piece is burning a little bit, go ahead and close your door. Close your damper all the way back down. Check your air settings. Make sure you've got a good little bit of flame going in there, but not too much flame. It's constantly monitoring, and it takes patience to learn what works best in your stove. Everybody's situation may be a little bit different depending on the type of stove, the area they're heating, the type of firewood. So those are some tips for keeping it going well. You can actually see we have some combustion burn going on in there now. You can see the smoke is catching on fire up above the logs. So those flames are re-burning any particulate that's in the smoke and allowing that to give us more heat. You can see now my numbers have worn mostly off, but we are at about 1,000 degrees there in the catalytic combustion chamber. So that's a good amount of heat. There you can see our flames burning really good in there. I've got a piece of maple and a piece of cherry in there currently. And then the bottom pieces that I put in at first were 2 pieces of oak. Now throughout the day while I'm burning this fire, I'm constantly adding wood when it needs added, keeping that damper closed so that the catalytic combustion happens, and always adjusting my airflow depending on the wood, how many pieces of wood in there, how hot the coals are. You may need to open and close the airflow a little bits at a time and then check and see how that has affected the burn. The other thing you want to do is not overcrowd your firebox. You can see I've got 4 pieces of wood in there right now. And I'm going to let those burn down before I put more pieces in. I see some people trying to stack, 5, 6, 7 fresh pieces of wood in on top of the coals, and that doesn't always produce the best fire. You want to learn your stove and what works best. Like I said, with catalytic combustion, I need some space in there so that the smoke coming off the wood reignites and gives us that secondary burn. Now, before I started this fire today, I actually cleaned out the entire firebox. It's going to be cold for 5 or 6 days in a row. I mean, really cold, single digits, negative wind chill factor. So I want to be able to keep this fire burning day and night for the next several days. Like I said, it was totally cold before we started, so hopefully this helped you out. If you're trying to figure out how to start a fire in a cold chimney and fireplace system and you keep getting that smoke filling your room, hopefully these tips helped you out. Make sure you leave a comment down below, tips that I may have forgotten. I'm sure a lot of other people who have been building fires and fireplaces longer than I have may have additional tips that they can offer. And like I said, this is just what works best for me with 20 years of experience with this Buck Stove Model 91 in our basement to heat our home. I've done a video in the past about how much money we save by heating our home with firewood in the winter. This is our primary heat source for the main section of our house. We do have electric baseboard heat as a backup source, but check out that video where we talk about how burning firewood can save you a lot of money, especially if you live in a rural area like us where you can supply your own firewood. We also happen to enjoy the hobby of firewooding, so chainsaws, log splitters, that's all fun for me anyway. So when I can forage the firewood and then burn it to provide heat for our house, it's a win-win. For those of you who came here looking for information about how to keep that smoke from filling your house when you're building a fire in a cold fireplace, hopefully you found this informative and entertaining. Make sure you give us a big thumbs up. Leave those comments down below. Check out some other videos. We've got lots of videos about how to best start a fire in a Buck stove. Like I said, how much money we save burning firewood, some tips and tricks on using this stove and heating your house with wood. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll see you again the next time.